That year, Emily had already retired from her job as a teacher and was beginning to get used to the silence that filled the house. She was a woman of quiet habits, one of those who still wrote her shopping list by hand and lined up books by size and color. She lived with her husband, Stephen, a writer known in the region for his novels, in an old stone house located at the top of a hill where the fog seemed to reside forever. The mornings smelled of coffee and damp wood, the afternoons of endless rain and time standing still. Her life passed between routine and stillness. He wrote locked in his office, while she took care of the garden and the order of the home. Nothing suggested that that rainy Tuesday would open a rift in her reality, one that would never close again. Emily remembered every detail of that day precisely. She'd been determined to clean the corner she'd always put off: the attic, the high shelves, the windows that no longer opened properly, when she received an unexpected call from Elena, her childhood friend, inviting her to have coffee downtown. She thought it would do her good to get away for a while, so she hired Caroline, a young student from the neighborhood who did part-time cleaning. She left her the key and left without a worry, but hours later when the phone rang, her voice trembled as she heard Caroline crying on the other end of the line. She said she'd seen a woman in a white dress standing on the stairs, silently looking at her. Bo ran back in the rain, her shoes soaked, her heart pounding in her throat. When she arrived, she found 2 police officers searching the house. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no footprints. Everything was in its place, as if nothing had happened. Caroline sat trembling on the couch, unable to articulate a coherent sentence. She only repeated that the woman had looked at her like she knew her. Emily tried to reassure her, but deep down she felt an ancient chill creeping into her bones, a fear she couldn't explain. The officers searched every room, even the attic, and left with a condescending smile. It was probably her imagination, they said. That phrase hung over the house like a shadow. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Stephen, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the event. While she mentally reviewed every detail, he read silently by the fireplace, without looking up from his book. He said Caroline must have been influenced, that these things happen when you spend too much time alone. But when the clock struck 2 in the morning, Emily heard footsteps, slow, precise, coming from upstairs. She got up carefully, took a flashlight, and climbed the wooden steps that creaked under her weight. In the dimness, she thought she saw a shadow move at the end of the hall, near the room where the family trunks were kept. When she turned on the light, no one was there, only the echo of their breathing and the distant sound of rain hitting the windows. Over the next few days, Emily tried to convince herself that it had all been a product of fatigue or her imagination. But something inside her resisted. Objects began to move without explanation. A mug she remembered leaving in the kitchen would appear in Stephen's study. A scarf folded on the bed would end up lying in the garden, soaked by the rain. The smell of old perfume, sweet and penetrating, sometimes wafted through the hallways, the same scent her mother used to wear decades ago. Stephen, however, just shrugged. "Maybe you moved it yourself and you don't remember," he would say with a tired smile. Emily was irritated by this paternal tone, this way of downplaying what tormented her. It was then that she began to jot down each incident in a notebook, as if recording the madness would help keep it under control. One afternoon, while cleaning Stephen's bookshelf, she noticed something strange on the wall behind a row of novels. The wallpaper had an uneven line, as if someone had tried to hide a crack. She carefully pulled it open and discovered a small gap. Hidden there was a dark, leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with tight, elegant writing, clearly a woman's. Emily read the first few paragraphs, her heart racing. They were fragments of stories, novel ideas, literary musings. But what took her breath away was recognizing on those pages scenes identical to those in books Stephen had published, even complete sentences. She closed the notebook with trembling hands, trying to understand what she had just found. That night, she waited until Stephen fell asleep to reopen the notebook. Every word seemed like a confession, a trapped voice crying out to be heard. There were notes about characters, landscapes, and a signature at the bottom of several pages. M. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She suddenly remembered her younger sister, Marina, who had disappeared more than 30 years ago, never heard from again after a work accident that the press had briefly covered. Stephen, her boyfriend at the time, was the one who comforted her most during the search, assuring her that one day she would return. Suddenly, the air became dense, and every corner of the house seemed complicit in a secret that had lived there, hidden in plain sight. At dawn, she confronted Stephen with the notebook in her hands. He looked at it for barely a second, and then let out a forced laugh, one of those that didn't fit the situation. He said it was old material, ideas, that some assistant of his had written years ago, and that he had simply adapted. Emily wanted to believe him, but something in his look disconcerted her. It wasn't guilt or shame, it was fear. From that day on, their relationship changed. Stephen began spending more time away from home, citing editorial commitments, while she sank into a mixture of anxiety and suspicion. Every time he went out, Emily went up to the attic hoping to find something else, even though the smell of dust and confinement made her cough until she cried. One night, as the wind battered the windows, Emily distinctly heard the sound of a chair being scraped in the attic. Her heart stopped. She went upstairs with a flashlight, and upon opening the door, noticed that the small back window was ajar, letting in a cold draft that stirred the papers stacked on the floor. Nothing seemed out of place except a cup with the dregs of lukewarm tea. Emily picked it up carefully. The liquid was still warm. She felt her legs tremble. It wasn't possible that someone had been there, and yet they had been. When she went downstairs, she found Stephen waiting for her in the living room. "With your ghosts again?" he muttered in annoyance. There was no hug, no comfort. That night they slept back to back, and the silence between them was more terrifying than any noise in the attic. The next morning, Emily decided to talk to Ramos, Stephen's editor, a man with a deep voice and courteous manner. She had known him for years, but they had never had more than a superficial conversation. She met him at a local coffee shop, and with trembling hands, showed him the leather-bound notebook. Ramos flipped through it silently, frowning. Finally, he said something that took her breath away. "Stephen hasn't been traveling. I've seen him at night. The lights in the attic always come on after midnight." Emily felt a sudden vertigo, as if all the air in the room had evaporated. She realized that the only place she hadn't looked for the truth was precisely the closest, her own home. That same night, Emily waited for the clock to strike midnight. From her room, she watched as a faint line of light filtered through the crack in the ceiling. She held her breath and climbed the steps soundlessly, each creak of the wood echoing like a heartbeat. When she reached the attic, the air was thick, heavy with dampness and the smell of confinement. In front of the table, lit by an old oil lamp, stood a hunched figure with long, white hair, writing with a quill pen. Emily didn't know whether to scream or faint. When the woman raised her head, their eyes met, and the world seemed to stop. It was Marina, pale, aged, but unmistakable. Time hadn't erased the bond of blood that united them. Emily's first impulse was to run to her, but her body didn't respond. Marina put her pen on the table, as if she had been waiting for this meeting forever. She didn't say a word, just looked at her with a mixture of relief and guilt. Emily burst into tears, and the sound seemed to awaken the entire house. They went down the stairs together in silence, while the walls creaked as if they too were breathing after years of keeping a secret. In the living room, Emily offered her tea, but Marina didn't drink it. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said Stephen's name. It was then that Emily realized that everything she had felt, the presences, the noises, the moved objects, were not ghosts, but life itself trying to come to light. Marina told her story with long pauses, as if each word weighed a decade. She had been there, in that attic, since the night she accidentally killed her boss while trying to defend herself from abuse. Stephen, who was then her brother-in-law, promised her help and silence. He brought her to the house under the guise of protecting her from justice and shame, but instead made her his prisoner. For the first few years, he brought her food and paper, encouraging her to write to keep her mind occupied. Over time, those texts became novels, and Stephen became an admired writer. Marina looked at him sadly as she remembered him, without resentment, only with an infinite weariness. "I wrote to survive," she murmured. "He published to continue living off me." Emily listened, her heart wrenched, feeling her entire life being rewritten before her. The dinners, the literary awards, the interviews, everything had been built on her sister's tragedy. She remembered how Stephen always avoided talking about the past, how he changed the subject every time someone mentioned Marina. And now she understood why. Guilt mingled with a rage that burned in her chest. She had slept next to the man who had turned their home into a prison. As Marina spoke, Emily noticed something else. At the back of the room, a portrait covered by a cloth. When she uncovered it, she saw a painting of a young Marina, signed in Stephen's handwriting. The irony was unbearable. Even her face had been stolen from her. When Stephen returned 2 days later, Emily was waiting for him in the living room. The entire house smelled of dampness and tension. He feigned surprise at seeing her awake at that hour, but his face drained of color when he noticed Marina at the foot of the stairs. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of the clock on the wall marked the suspended time. Emily asked him why, with a calmness that hurt more than the scream. Stephen stammered excuses, spoke of protecting the family, of saving his reputation, of a necessary decision. But each word was hollower than the last. Marina, her voice trembling, only said, "You never protected me. You erased me." That sentence seemed to break something in the air. For the first time, Stephen lowered his gaze, defeated by the truth. That morning, Emily accompanied Marina to the police station. The confession was long and confusing, filled with tears, silences, and details the officers could barely process. When they found the original manuscripts, the forged names, and the bank records in Stephen's name, the case turned into a scandal. News spread quickly, and within hours, the man who had been admired as a literary genius became a symbol of deceit and cruelty. Emily, exhausted, thought only of one thing: that her sister could breathe fresh air, even if it was just for a day. But deep down, she feared that after so much confinement, freedom would hurt too much. The following days were a mixture of relief and nightmare. Marina was taken to a medical center to assess her condition, while the press camped outside the house. The journalists shouted questions that Emily didn't know how to answer. The walls still bore traces of her confinement: handprints, scraps of paper with unfinished sentences, forgotten cups of tea. Every corner breathed sadness. Stephen, handcuffed, was brought in to testify. He tried to defend himself, saying it had all been an act of compassion, that Marina had wanted to stay there, that he had only done what was necessary. No one believed him. Emily watched him as they loaded him into the police car. For the first time, she saw him small, fragile, like a shadow of what he pretended to be. She felt not hatred, but deep compassion for what ambition can do to a man. The nights were silent again, but not peaceful. Emily walked around the house, feeling Marina's absence as a distinct presence, brighter, but also painful. She sat on the stairs with a blanket over her shoulders and pored over the notebooks she'd found. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, filled with ideas, drawings, phrases, and fragments of novels that had never seen the light of day. She read every word with respect, as if each line were a ransom. It was during one of those early mornings that she decided to fulfill her sister's last wish, to publish everything under her name, not out of revenge, but to give back to the world the voice that had been stolen from her. Weeks passed until the court confirmed what everyone suspected. Stephen would be convicted of kidnapping, forgery, and concealing a crime. His public image collapsed overnight. Bookstores withdrew his books, contracts were canceled, and universities that had once invited him to give talks now denied ever having met him. Emily observed everything with a strange calm, as if living outside her own body. She had lost her husband and recovered her sister, but in both cases, the result was the same. Silence. Sometimes she wondered if the house could ever be a home again, or if it was doomed to remain a monument to grief. One afternoon, she received a call from the hospital. Marina had been found lifeless in her room. There were no signs of violence, just a letter carefully folded on the table. Emily opened it with trembling hands. The handwriting was firm, almost serene. "Do not fear for me. I have lived too long in the shadows. Now I want to rest where words do not haunt me. Do with my books what I could not. Give them to the world." Emily wept soundlessly, holding the paper to her chest. In that moment she understood that Marina's freedom lay not in justice or punishment, but in the final act of writing her truth. The burial was discreet, without cameras or speeches. Only Emily, Editor Ramos, and a couple of nurses who had cared for Marina attended. The sky was gray, and the air smelled of wet earth and sad flowers. Emily placed a leather-bound notebook on the grave, the first she had ever found. "This was the beginning of everything," she murmured. Ramos, moved, promised to help her fulfill his sister's wish. The following months were devoted to revising, editing, and organizing the manuscripts. Emily spent hours reading the texts aloud, discovering in them the strength of a mind that had survived confinement. With each page, she felt that Marina was still alive, watching her from some corner of time, free at last. When the first book was published under Marina's name, the entire country fell silent. Critics called it the voice that confinement failed to silence. Emily wasn't looking for fame or redemption, but upon seeing the cover, a mixture of pride and sadness flooded her. Stephen, from prison, sent a letter that she never opened. There was no room for forgiveness, only for the truth. With the royalties from the book, Emily transformed the attic, that space that had been a prison, into a small public library. She opened the windows, let in the light, painted the walls white, and placed a plaque with one of Marina's quotes. "Words only breathe when they are written in freedom." Over time, the story became a symbol of resistance. Students, journalists, and women from all over the country visited the house to learn about Marina's library. Emily greeted them serenely, always with hot tea and a melancholic smile. Sometimes she stayed to listen to their stories. Many had also been silenced, relegated, or made invisible in their own lives. In these encounters, Emily found a new form of companionship, a family made up of voices that refused to disappear. That house, once a prison, now breathed hope, and for the first time in years, Emily slept without fear of footsteps in the attic. The only sound at night was the leaves of the trees gently tapping against the windows. If you're reading this far, perhaps you also believe in the power of stories that are born from pain but end in freedom. Tell me where you're following this story from. I like to imagine that. On the other side of the screen, someone is also letting a little light into their own darkness. Over the months, Marina's name was officially recognized as the author of all the works published under Stephen's imprint. New editions bore her signature in gold letters, and part of the proceeds went to scholarships for young writers. Emily, though reluctant to accept tributes, attended one in her name. As she took the stage, she spoke not of the tragedy, but of the courage to face the truth. "Silence is a prison," she said in a firm voice, "and every word spoken with courage is a key that opens a locked door." Heartfelt applause filled the room, and for the first time she felt that the cycle was about to end. Over time, Emily began to write short texts not to publish, but to stay close to her sister. Her notebooks filled with reflections on memory, guilt, and forgiveness. She wrote sitting by the window overlooking the hills, where the afternoon sun filtered through the clouds as if also seeking reconciliation with the earth. Sometimes she thought about how something so terrible had happened for so many years without anyone noticing. But she understood that horror doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, disguises itself as routine, and feeds on the fear of scandal. That revelation accompanied her in every daily gesture: watering the plants, arranging the books, turning on the attic lamp each night. On the anniversary of Marina's death, Emily organized a public reading at the library. Dozens of people attended, bringing white flowers and old notebooks as tributes. When she finished reading an unpublished fragment, she looked toward the open attic window and swore she heard a distant, soft, almost childlike laugh. She didn't feel fear, but a profound peace. It was as if the house, after so many years, breathed a sigh of relief. That night, before going to sleep, she wrote her final diary entry. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it allows me to continue living in it without losing myself." Then she turned off the light and the silence returned, this time filled with calm. Years passed and Emily grew old in the same house where it all happened, but she no longer feared the memories. She had learned to live with them, like someone who accepts scars as part of their skin. Every morning she opened the attic windows to let in the fresh air and the smell of fresh rain. The walls, once damp and dark, were now covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters from readers thanking Marina for her courage. Emily read each one with a mixture of emotion and serenity. She knew that her sister, somewhere, would be smiling at how her voice continued to inspire others to break the silence. One day, while organizing the library shelves, she found a yellowed page she'd never seen before between the pages of a book. It was a poem, written in Marina's firm handwriting. It spoke of freedom, loneliness, and the fire that no darkness can extinguish. Emily framed it and placed it in the entryway, right under a lamp that remained lit every night. "So that no one ever lives in the shadows again," she always told visitors. That gesture became a tradition. Every year, on the anniversary of the publication of the first book, someone new would leave an anonymous text on the door, as if Marina's story continued to be written in many hands. As spring arrived, the house began to fill with younger visitors, students, budding writers, travelers seeking inspiration in that place where darkness had given way to truth. Emily watched them tenderly, like a silent guardian of the past. Some spent hours reading in the light filtering through the attic window. Others left letters or flowers in the small garden. Every gesture seemed to keep Marina's memory alive. For Emily, it was a form of reparation, proof that art, when born from pain, can transform even the air of a place marked by tragedy. Over time, she began writing her own book, not about Marina, but about life after the discovery. She titled it The House That Learned to Breathe, a sincere chronicle of guilt, redemption, and silence. In its pages, she spoke of how the truth doesn't destroy, but purifies, of how sometimes it's necessary to lose everything to see what truly matters. The publication was modest, but honest, and many readers found in those lines the courage to face their own shadows. Emily, now an old woman, understood that she hadn't lived in vain. She had turned a secret into a voice and a prison into a refuge for others. One afternoon, as the sun fell behind the hills, Emily climbed into the attic for the last time. The air smelled of old wood and dried ink, and dust motes danced in the golden light filtering through the window. She walked to the table where Marina had spent her final years writing and placed a hand on the now polished, clean surface. There were no traces of confinement left, only peace. She sat down, opened her notebook, and wrote a single sentence: "The truth always finds a way to open the right door." Then she closed her eyes, and for a moment she thought she heard her sister's voice whispering her name. It wasn't fear, but a loving farewell. When she went downstairs, she turned on all the lights in the house and stared at the glow reflected in the glass. The house no longer belonged to pain, but to memory. She decided to donate it to the municipality as a cultural heritage site so that it could continue to be a space for art and reflection. At the dedication ceremony, the village children read excerpts from Marina's books, and Emily smiled at how each word found new life in other mouths. For the first time in many years, she felt she could rest. not because the past was gone, but because it had finally been told. That night, Emily sat on the porch with a warm cup of tea in her hands. The air was still, and fireflies flickered over the garden like tiny sparks of life. She thought about everything she had been through: love, betrayal, fear, loss. It all mingled into the same thread that had brought her here. She had learned that the truth doesn't always liberate immediately. Sometimes it hurts before it heals. But she had also discovered that silence, no matter how comfortable it may seem, eventually suffocates the one who holds it. She looked up at the star-filled sky and felt grateful, not only for having survived, but for having finally understood that even from horror, something luminous can be born. The next day, Emily closed the front door for the last time and walked down the hill, leaving behind the house that had witnessed it all. She didn't look back. There was no need. The wind carried with it the rustling of the leaves and, between them, the feeling that Marina was still there, free in every word, on every page, in every glance that paused to read her name. Emily disappeared into the dawn mist, her steps calm, knowing that she had finally kept her promise to give back the voice of the one who should never have lost it. Months passed, and Emily and Marina's story became something of a local legend. Visitors who came to the hill said that at dusk, a female figure could be seen in the attic, writing in the dim light. Some believed it was the sun's reflection on the glass. Others swore they heard the sound of a quill gliding across paper. Emily neither denied nor confirmed anything. She just smiled. She said that perhaps houses that hold so much pain also learn to tell their own stories, and that if one listens with a calm heart, one can hear the echo of words that were once silenced. Years later, when Emily passed away, the entire town attended her farewell. On her coffin, they placed an open notebook and a note with a phrase written in her own handwriting: "No one dies completely as long as someone remembers their voice." The library remained open, the attic remained lit, and every anniversary, a reader would leave a white flower next to Marina's portrait. Thus, between paper, memory, and hope, the truth continued to breathe, free at last, and with it, the two sisters, forever united by the invincible power of words.